On November 18, 1995, at a steel mill in eastern Pennsylvania, a furnace went cold for the last time. No cameras were rolling, no crowd gathered. A machine that had run almost non-stop for more than a century simply stopped. 9 decades earlier, that same mill had rolled the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, and much of the Manhattan skyline. It had built more than 1,000 ships that helped win 2 world wars. At its peak, it employed close to 300,000 Americans and produced more steel in a single year than entire countries. This was Bethlehem Steel. For most of the 20th century, it was the second largest steel company on the planet. Its name was stamped into the bones of modern America, quietly, permanently, almost everywhere you looked. And then, in less than 1 generation, it disappeared. Not in a single dramatic collapse, something slower. Something the people running the company could see coming and somehow still couldn't stop. This is the story of how Bethlehem Steel built America, and how the very things that made it unstoppable eventually became the reason it couldn't survive. The story doesn't start with a giant, it starts with a failure. In 1857, a small group of investors in eastern Pennsylvania founded an ironworks called the Saucona Iron Company. Within months, a national financial panic nearly wiped it out before a single rail left the plant. A local railroad executive named Robert Sayre bought what remained. He moved the operation to the south bank of the Lehigh River to a town called Bethlehem and hired an engineer named John Fritz, considered one of the most inventive ironmen in America, to design new blast furnaces. On January 5, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, the first furnace lit.
Nobody watching that fire could have guessed what it would eventually become. For decades, the company stayed modest. Rails, then armor plate for Navy battleships. Steady, unremarkable growth. Around the plant, an entire company town grew up along the river. Rows of workers' houses, churches, and shops filled with immigrant families from Hungary, Poland, and Italy who had crossed an ocean for a job at the furnace gate. Then, in 1901, a man arrived who would change everything. His name was Charles Schwab. He had started in the steel business at 19 years old, working for Andrew Carnegie. By 35, he was running Carnegie's entire steel empire. By J.P. Morgan in 1901, Schwab became the first president of the largest corporation on Earth, United States Steel. He didn't stay long. Clashes with Morgan's board pushed him out in 1903. So Schwab did something almost nobody expected. Instead of retiring wealthy, he bought controlling interest in a struggling mid-sized steelmaker most Americans had never heard of, Bethlehem. He reportedly told his secretary he had thought it all through, and if they failed, they would fail big. In 1904, Schwab merged Bethlehem with a handful of shipbuilding companies and created the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He hired a young engineer named Eugene Grace to help him run it. Together, these 2 men would turn a company producing less than 1% of the nation's steel into the second largest steel producer on Earth in under 35 years. How does a company grow that fast? By betting everything on a shape nobody else was making. In 1908, Bethlehem introduced something called the wide flange beam, a thick H-shaped steel column strong enough to carry loads no other beam on the market.
They were running out of room to expand outward. The only direction left was up. But building up required steel strong enough to hold 50 stories on the footprint of a single city block. Bethlehem's new beam solved it. Almost overnight, it became the steel skyscrapers were built from. It went into the Chrysler Building, into Rockefeller Center, into Madison Square Garden. In March of 1930, workers began raising 57,000 tons of Bethlehem steel into the frame of a building that would become the tallest in the world, the Empire State Building. Its steel also reinforced Hoover Dam, Alcatraz Island, and dozens of other landmarks that still define the American landscape today. But of everything Bethlehem ever built, one project would test the company more than any other. A bridge that some engineers of the era believed shouldn't have been possible to build at all. In the mid-1930s, engineers in San Francisco were planning something audacious, a suspension bridge across the mouth of the bay, exposed to fog, brutal winds, and salt air that could rust ordinary steel within a few short years. Bethlehem supplied nearly 70,000 tons of steel for the project. But raw strength wasn't the only problem. Salt doesn't care how strong your steel is. It corrodes it anyway. So Bethlehem's engineers developed something new, a red-orange primer designed to protect the bridge's steel for decades against the ocean air. That coating is the reason the Golden Gate Bridge is orange today. It wasn't chosen for beauty. It was chosen to survive. The steel itself had to survive something else too. California sits on some of the most active fault lines in the country, and the bridge's frame needed enough flexibility to sway in an earthquake without tearing itself apart.
Bethlehem's engineers built that give directly into the structure. Not every part of Bethlehem's story was triumphant. In 1910, thousands of workers at the Bethlehem plant went on strike over pay and grueling hours. Schwab responded by calling in Pennsylvania's newly formed state police to break it. No union would organize successfully inside Bethlehem Steel for another 31 years until 1941, 2 years after Schwab himself had died. The same toughness that built bridges and skyscrapers could also be turned against the people building them. And yet, for the men who worked there, Bethlehem was also a source of fierce pride, which dominated American competition for nearly 2 decades, a small sign of just how much identity this company built beyond the furnace walls. By the late 1930s, Bethlehem wasn't just building skylines anymore. It was quietly becoming something the country would need far sooner than anyone wanted to admit. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Eugene Grace, by then Bethlehem's chairman, reportedly told his golf partners the company was about to make some money. It was a blunt thing to say. It was also true. Within a few years, the United States was fighting a war on 2 fronts, and Bethlehem Steel became what historians later called the Arsenal of America. The company ran 15 shipyards on both coasts, the largest private shipbuilding operation on Earth. It built battleships, aircraft carriers, oil tankers, Liberty ships, assembled in weeks instead of months. On the Maryland coast, its Sparrows Point complex alone grew into the largest steel plant in the world, employing more than 30,000 workers of its own, and helping launch some of the very first Liberty ships built for the war.
By the time the fighting ended, Bethlehem's yards had built more than 1,000 vessels, and its workers had repaired or serviced tens of thousands more. At the company's headquarters plant alone, more than 30,000 people worked around the clock. Company-wide, Bethlehem employed close to 300,000 Americans, many of them women, stepping for the first time into jobs that had always belonged to men. Most of those new shipyard workers had never built a ship in their lives. Bethlehem ran its own crash training program, turning welders, riveters, and machinists out of ordinary Americans in a matter of weeks, not years. In 1943, Grace set a target that skeptics called impossible: build 1 ship every single day. By year's end, Bethlehem very nearly did it. The company produced more steel during the war than the entire output of the United Kingdom. It was by almost every measure the peak of American industrial power. And almost nobody inside the company noticed the first cracks already forming beneath it. For a company built on scale and toughness, the biggest threats it would ever face weren't foreign armies. They were habits. Habits nobody thought to question, because for 50 years, those habits had only ever produced success. The warning signs went back further than most people realize. As early as 1929, Eugene Grace received a bonus of more than $1.6 million, over 3% of the company's entire profit that year. Bonuses like it had been paid to Bethlehem executives for nearly 2 decades. Stockholders eventually sued, demanding the company claw back $36 million in payouts. The case settled quietly in 1931. Nothing structurally changed. Decades later, historians would point back to this moment as early evidence of something deeper, a management culture built around personal reward, insulated from outside challenge, that never trained the next generation of leaders for hard times. Nobody could have known it yet, but the pattern was already set. For a while, none of it seemed to matter. After the war, American steel had almost no real competition left. Europe and Japan lay in ruins. Bethlehem's mills ran at full capacity for years, and in 1957, the company produced more steel in a single year than at any point in its history, 19 million tons. It felt permanent. It was not. While American mills kept running many of the same furnaces that had built the Empire State Building decades earlier, something was happening on the other side of the world. Japan and West Germany were rebuilding their steel industries from scratch, with brand new electric furnaces and continuous casting technology that produced steel faster and far more cheaply than the aging American mills ever could.
American steelmakers faced a choice: rebuild to compete or keep running what already worked. Bethlehem largely chose the second option. Much of the new competition wasn't only coming from overseas.
Inside the United States, small, aggressive companies called mini-mills were melting scrap steel in electric furnaces at a fraction of the cost of Bethlehem's massive, aging plants. Bethlehem had the resources to adopt this technology decades before its competitors did. It chose not to. In 1959, a nationwide steel strike shut down American mills for 116 days. Builders who couldn't wait for domestic steel turned to foreign suppliers instead, and many of them never fully came back. It was a small crack, but cracks, left alone, tend to spread. By the 1960s and 70s, cheap imported steel from Japan and Western Europe was undercutting Bethlehem's prices on the very kinds of projects that had made the company famous. Builders who once demanded Bethlehem Steel by name started choosing whoever was cheapest. In 1972, just as those warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore, Bethlehem's executives approved construction of a new corporate headquarters outside the city. It was a gleaming, cross-shaped skyscraper, 21 stories of polished steel and glass, designed to project permanence and power. They called it Martin Tower. 10 years after it opened, the company that built it posted the largest loss in its history. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion in a single year. It triggered a chain reaction nobody inside the company could reverse. Plants closed. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off, first at the mills, then eventually in the polished offices of Martin Tower itself. Thousands of former shipyard and mill workers would later file lawsuits over decades of asbestos exposure, adding hundreds of millions more. And every closed plant created a new permanent burden. Retired steelworkers owed pensions and health care for the rest of their lives, paid for by a company with fewer and fewer active workers left to cover the bill. In towns built entirely around Bethlehem's mills, the closures weren't just economic, they were personal. Fathers who had worked the same furnace their fathers once worked found no job waiting for their own children. Entire neighborhoods that had existed because of one company slowly emptied out, one layoff at a time. The same immigrant families who had once crossed an ocean for a job at that furnace gate now watched their grandchildren leave town to find work somewhere else entirely. There was no single moment when Bethlehem Steel died. There were 1,000 small ones. On November 18, 1995, the same date more than a century later from where this story began, the main plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, rolled steel for the last time. By 1998, every operation on that site had gone silent. In 2001, the company that had once outproduced entire nations filed for federal bankruptcy protection. 2 years later, it was gone. Its remaining plants and subsidiaries were sold to the International Steel Group. Within a few more years, those same assets passed into the hands of a company headquartered on another continent entirely, ArcelorMittal. The name Bethlehem Steel, stamped into the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, and 1,000 ships that helped win a world war, no longer belonged to an American company at all.
He died more than $300,000 in debt. The man who built one of the wealthiest companies in America died broke. Today, if you drive along the Lehigh River in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, you'll still see them. 5 enormous blast furnaces, silent now, rising 200 feet into the sky, rust bleeding down their steel in shifting shades of copper and blue. Steelworkers call them furnaces. The tourism signs call them steel stacks, a name some of the men who actually worked there still don't fully recognize as their own history. Concerts happen here now, festivals. A museum stands nearby, telling the story of a company that once employed half this city. In 2009, a casino opened on part of the old plant grounds. Building it required 16,000 tons of steel, and construction was delayed by a global steel shortage. The company that once outproduced entire nations couldn't be found anywhere to supply its own hometown. Bethlehem Steel didn't just build American skylines and help win a war. It became a case study economists and historians still argue over, proof that the very same strength that makes a company feel unstoppable can also be the reason it never sees the ground shifting beneath it. The furnace that went cold in 1995 never lit again. But walk the same ground where immigrant families once settled for a job at the furnace gate, where a company soccer team once drew crowds, where If you stand beneath those 5 rusting towers today and look up, it's not hard to understand why, for nearly a century, this was where America came from.